Hello everyone, welcome to the course Disability Studies in India, Historical, Social and Culture Perspectives, right. So, we are talking about stigma, and the first two lectures in this module were just an humble attempt to define, to rethink what stigma is all about, right. So, the first lecture was about what is stigma, second obviously I took stigma from the Irving Goffman's perspective, right, what Irving Goffman thinks, because he has extensively contributed in shaping the discourse on stigma and is a seminal book. So, I recommended you to read as well if you get time, right. So, moving ahead, I am in this lecture I am going to talk about stigma, disability and identity, and we are going to navigate the complex interactions or intersections, how they navigate. Like we have stigma, then we have obviously from the perspectives of disability, right. So, keeping in this mind, I would suggest you two things. The one, that please read the book that I suggested, like obviously Irving Goffman's book. At the same time, when you start thinking, start visualizing particular situations where a discredited person is moving in the public spaces and how he is received by the society. Why is it so? What are the other interpretations that you have? Suppose if he changes the society, what are the impact or influence or change he will receive in his life, right? Will his life change? What kind of change he would notice and why is it so? So, your job is not just to read, but also visualize these scenes. So, you can think widely about disability and identity. So, talking about this identity, stigma and disability, let me ask you one question, right. How stigma is related to identity, right. What is the function of stigma in shaping your identity, right. So, I am sure that it is easy to answer, because I have already discussed that one is to how do you look at yourself, and second one is how society look at you, right. And identity is something which is shaped by the society, right. You are born as a man, man is identity given by the society to you, and obviously your actions, reiteration of those actions, your performances that you do, they also determines your identity. And as we have already discussed, that identity evolves, it is not fixed, it changes, it moves constantly, continuously, all right. So, keep this in mind, and then obviously we will talk about subjectivity in next coming lectures. So, look at the slide number 1. With the slide number 1, if you see, is stigma, disability and identity are interwoven aspects of social existence that shape personal and collective experiences. In examining these dimensions, it is essential to consider how social perception of disability influence identity formation, right. You remember, this is the question that I was raising, identity formation. You got this? Impacting those with disabilities on multiple levels, from self-perception to social inclusion and access to rights. So, stigma surrounding disability is deeply rooted in cultural attitude that position disability as a deviation from the norm, right. It is a cultural attitude that position disability as a deviation from the norm. So, derived from the Greek word stigma, which signifies a mark of shape, right, a mark of shame. Stigma functions as a mechanism through which societies categorize people, often relegating those with disabilities to marginal status, right. So, Goffman described stigma as a mark that sets people apart, effectively spoiling their social identity in the eyes of others. So, for people with disabilities, stigma often manifests through stereotyping, discrimination, and social exclusion. So, the only one important point that I wanted to highlight here is deviation from the norm, right. How do you get that stigma is because you deviate from the norm, and we have already discussed the concept of norm in details, and I am sure by now you must have read also Leonard J. Davis enforcing normalcy. So, when we deviate from the norm, let us say for example, there is expectation that how your body should be, there is expectation how your behavior should be, there is expectation of how your bodily color should be, and every expectations, your status, right, so on and so forth. So, when we look at these status and then that is how you do not reach to that expectation, you do not meet that expectations, what happens? You deviate from the norm. That leads to, right, that results in a stigma, right. So, deviation from the norm, which means you are going to carry the stigma with yourself. So, due to that what happens now, because obviously I am expecting something and you are not able to meet the expectations, what I will do? I will maintain a distance from you. So, society also does the same, right. Society excludes you, society marginalizes you, society does not treat you equally. And my concern, which I have been constantly raising, is that social exclusion is justified. It does not even look that it is a bad, it does not even, people look at it as if it is a bad identity, or people look at it as a something bad happening. It is like this injustice looks just to the people, that is a problem, right. People find that is normal, that is natural, that is where our concern is, all right. So, think on these lines, that how people are discredited, disgraced on certain logic, however faulty that logic is, right. But that logic is governing the society, that logic is regulating us, that logic has become important instrument to maintain the society, all right. So, one has to think on these lines, right. So, look at the next slide please. So, the origin of stigma related to disability can be traced to historical attitudes that viewed physical and mental impairment as divine punishment or moral failings. Although contemporary societies have largely shifted away from these overtly negative interpretations, underlying biases remain entrenched, often perpetuated through language, media representation and institutional practices, right. I have also discussed this. So, this stigmatization has tangible consequences. What are the tangible consequences? Limiting access to education, employment, healthcare. More than mere inconvenience, these barriers save life opportunities, reinforcing the perception that disability is synonymous with limitations or incapacity, all right. So, let us look at the now social model of disability, which was developed in the late 20th century by disability right activist and a scholar. Obviously, I have already talked the origin, right, that late 90s, you can see the development of disability in US and UK. So, the social model of disability, which was developed in late 20th century, challenges the notion that disability is an individual problem. That challenge, like where people think that is a limitation or incapacity, was questioned. Instead, it posits that disability arises from interaction between people with impairment and societal structure that fail to accommodate their needs. So, according to this model, it is not the impairment itself, but the social environment that disables people by creating physical, economic and attitudinal barriers. So, the social model reframes disability as a social construct, advocating for the removal of these obstacles and the integration of inclusive practices. So, for instance, a wheelchair user is not disabled by their inability to walk, but by inaccessibility of building and transportation, which we have already covered, and this perspective shifts the focus from fixing the individual to reconfiguring the environment, right. Fostering a more inclusive society, it challenges the stigma attached to disability by reframing it as a matter of diversity rather than deficiency. So, this idea was rooted out by social model of disability, and this was celebrated. Identity is a complex construct shaped by personal experiences, cultural backgrounds, social interactions. So, in terms of people with disabilities, identity formation involves navigating both personal and social perception of disability. So, many people with disability confront a paradox of self-perception. While they may not define themselves solely by their disability, societal stigma often compels them to respond to the label and its associated stereotypes. All right. So, what we understand by now is two things. The one, before the social model of disability, people were realizing, people were experiencing, people were thinking that disability is synonymous with deficiency, right. If a person is not able to perform, it is not because of environmental problems. One has to not reconfigure the environment, but individual has to work on himself or herself. Here you see that how stigma can be shifted, right. Nowhere people with disabilities are problematic here, because it is not about body that is problematic, but it's infrastructure that is problematic. So, social model of disability tries to certain extent to fight against those stigmas associated with people with disabilities, all right. But obviously, this attitudinal barrier takes long time to be removed from the mind of the people, right. So, we will talk about it later. And the next we have is identity. As we were talking about, we have already talked about it, that identity is a complex construct, right. It is a very complex because it is shaped by personal experiences, cultural backgrounds, and also social interactions, right. This is many factors that shape your identity. But why I am discussing it? Why I am talking about it? Right? The very purpose why I am discussing it, that people do not look themselves, like people may look themselves as non-disabled or fine, right? But it is society, it is a societal stigma that often compels them, all right. That societal perception, what they have, they compel you to respond to that label, right. They compel you to respond to those associated stereotypes. You got this idea? So, that is a problem. Here identity is not what only you think about yourself, it is also what society presumes, like how society, like how will you form a commonality, right. I have discussed this in detail, that about minority identity, right, if you remember that. Okay, there are certain identifiability, recognizability, facing, and so on and so forth. There are multiple, I told you, right. So, I am not going to talk about it. But the point what I am making is that how you respond to that label, that becomes important. How do you talk about it? That becomes significant, right. So, look at the next slide please, and the next slide I am talking about how it can become a powerful aspect of one's identity, leading to the development of a positive disability identity. This can be seen in the disability rights movement and the concept of crip pride, which embrace disability as a natural aspect of human diversity. By fostering a sense of pride and solidarity, these movements counteract the internalization of stigma. So, transforming disability from a source of shame to an aspect of personal and collective empowerment, right. This redefinition allows people to reclaim their identities, viewing themselves as active agents rather than passive subject of societal prejudice. So, the relationship between disability and identity is not universally positive or singular. While some people may fully embrace their disability as core part of their identity, others may see it as one aspect among many. So, identity is fluid. People with disability experience a range of identities shaped by race, gender, sexuality, caste, class, culture. These intersecting identities complicate the experience of disability, highlighting that it cannot be understood in isolation from other social dimensions. Right? This is what I was talking about. So, then we have a term called intersectionalities, which is crucial in understanding how disability identity intersect with other identities. Let us say, for example, we have a black woman with disability. They may face compounded discrimination due to both racial and disability stigma. One is racial, second one is disability. So, recognizing this intersection is essential for creating nuanced understanding of disability identity and dismantling stigma across diverse contexts. So, intersectional analysis reveals that experiences of stigma and discrimination are not monolithic. They vary depending on cultural, socioeconomic and political factors. In some culture, disabilities are stigmatized less if they are visible or physically acceptable, while invisible disabilities such as mental health condition may attract more stigma. By acknowledging these complex intersections, we can better address the specific needs and challenges of people with disability, promoting a more inclusive societies. All right. So, what I have been talking about is that I am sure that this is not something new, but it is just that I am giving you from the perspectives of directly from how to connect identity and disability, right. So, I am talking about that how disability is a very diverse, right, it is a fluid, identity is a very fluid, right. It is dynamic, it changes, right, and also as I had already discussed that identity is in terms of people with disabilities very diverse, like one disabled person may not feel associated with other disability identity. They may be from society's point of view, they both are disabled, but their both experiences are rich and dynamic and different. So, they may not feel comfortable in being associated with other identities, right, or with other forms of disability identity. So, this is what we have to keep in the mind. For example, when I was talking about a black woman being disabled, the two identities, racial identity, gender identity and disability identity. Or let us say for example, white women being disabled, both are very opposite to each other in terms of even their disability, right, even in terms of their gender. Because it is not like gender is something that is natural, no, even the experience of being women as a black has a different meaning, is different connotations, different thinking patterns, different way to look at it. So, which is why when you are thinking about identity formation, when you are working on identity formation of people with disabilities, it is a very, very complex, unlike racial identity or some other identity. Like I have been talking about that a person who is colored, there is a possibility he may not get up in the morning as a white, right, until and unless some miracle happens. But in terms of people with disability, if you are disabled, if you are not disabled, there is a possibility that you may have that identity, if not today, then maybe tomorrow, right, or some other time eventually. Let us say even if you, anyway you have to be old at one point of time, and then you will face the problem, or let us say people will consider you dependent and all that, meaning that they have associated with people with disabilities. All right. So, let us look at the next slide please. The disability right movements has played a pivotal role in challenging stigma and promoting a more inclusive understanding of disability identity. So, through activism, advocacy and legislation such as Americans with Disability Act in the United States, the movement has fought for accessibility, representation and the right to self-determination. This is very significant. I mean, they all, but but generally people do not get it, even if they have accessibility and other things, right. So, determination. So, this American with Disability Act along with similar legislative framework worldwide emphasizes the importance of rights over charity, framing disability as a civil right issues. So, disability activism has not only brought about structural changes, but also fostered a shift in how disability is understood and represented. So, by promoting terms like, obviously we have a problem with these terms, but still with neurodiverse activists challenge the assumptions that normalcy should be the standard for human existence, right. So, the arts, media, literature, they have emerged as a powerful platforms for reshaping disability narratives. So, with works by disabled artists, writers and performers expanding society's understanding of disability and challenging stereotypes. Through these efforts, people with disability are given greater control over their own stories, allowing for a fuller, more nuanced expression and their identities. So, achieving a stigma-free society requires a multifaceted approach that addresses both the societal structure that perpetuates stigma and the cultural attitudes that normalize it. So, education plays a very crucial role in reducing stigma with curricula that promote disability awareness, fostering empathy and inclusion from a young age. So, similarly, media representation is also very vital, authentic, diverse portrayal of disability in film, television and literature that can challenge stereotypes and they broaden public understanding. All right. So, this policy and legal framework, they also evolve to support the full inclusion of people with disabilities. So, this include enforcing accessibility standards, ensuring equitable access to healthcare and education, and protecting the rights of disabled people in all spheres of life. So, there is a legal challenge that must be accompanied by shift in public consciousness, recognizing that disability is a natural part of human diversity and not a marker of inferiority. So, stigma, disability and identity are deeply intertwined, right, and shaping the lived experiences of people with disabilities and the society in which they live. So, by understanding disability as a social construct, right, that is the first thing important, is that proving that disability is a social construct, it is not individual problem or person attributes, right. So, this is like by understanding disability as a social construct and recognizing the agency of people with disabilities, we can begin to dismantle stigma and support the development of positive, empowered disability identities. So, through activism, inclusive policies and changes in cultural representation, society can work toward creating an environment that values diversity, that enable people with disability to define their identities in their own terms. So, in doing so, what we do, we contribute to a world that not only accommodates, but celebrates the full range of human experience. All right. So, there are two ways that we are talking about it. There are two ways we are thinking about it, right, and we are considering it. So, the one thing is that first thing that we have to think about that disability is a social construct, right. So, disability has been constructed by the society. So, once we get this notion, for example, right, when I say that, I nowhere suggest that they are not impaired, they do not feel it, but I am talking about that the way there are multiple cultural factors that contribute in constructing the disability identity. All right. So, when we are talking about this, the moment we do this, the moment we establish this fact that disability is a constructed identity, right, it is what happens thereafter. The moment we do it, we can challenge a multiple understanding that is associated with people with disabilities. All right, there are multiple understanding that is associated with people with disabilities. So, when we think in a larger framework, then we try to understand that we have to question that, we have to figure it out. Second thing is what we try to explain this to you. The second point is that awareness. Let us say for example, if I ask you that go and find out the stories, poems produced by people with disabilities in 2000, in 1990s, in 1980s, you will not find. Even if you find, most of the stories are narrated by, not by people with disabilities, but people without disabilities about people with disabilities. So, until and unless we fight, we challenge that notion, we won't be able to overcome, right. So, therefore, we have to work on this and eliminate those stigma associated with people with disability, and it is also important to listen the stories directly from people with disabilities, right. So, this is what I wanted to tell you when I am talking about stigma, identity, and in relation to people with disabilities. In the next lecture, I will be talking about subjectivity, right. This is important lecture going to be in terms of thinking how people with disability are subjectified by society, right. So, I will invoke many theoreticians and thinkers to talk about it. So, with this I would like to end my lecture here. Thank you so much for your patient listening. Thank you so much.